On rare occasions in my life, in moments of desperation, I have been forced to make a rather perilous journey where few men dare to go. It's a frightening place called Jo-Ann Fabrics. Now, I don't visit fabric stores very often, but when I do, I always seem to be, first of all, the only male in the store, and people look at me as though I were some invader and looter of a far-off land where yarn and thimbles flow like milk and honey. So usually I get in and out as fast as I can with this look on my face that says, you know, I come in peace, I mean you no harm. But I've noticed in my limited fabric store experience that there is usually a bin where they keep all the extra remnants of cloth. It's fabric that's been cut and it's too small really to be used for major projects. So it is banished to the realm of the remnants, where it lives out its days with some meager hope that a passerby will catch its eye and pick it up. It's a sad and kind of troublesome life for a rejected remnant. But if there were ever a feast of the remnants, we would use the readings that we have in today's liturgy. God says through the prophet Zephaniah, I will leave as a remnant in your midst a people humble and lowly, a people that will remind all those around them, all those who have abandoned the faith, all those who have blended in with the cultures around them, all those who have forgotten what God has done for them. That remnant will be a reminder of God's covenant, a reminder of God's presence among them. God wants the remnant. His eye is attracted to that bin of humanity that feels rejected and lowly. And he wants to use them to make something beautiful. St. Paul says as much in that second reading. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Rather, God chose the lowly and despised to shame the strong. God dives into the remnant bin to pull out what is rejected and put it to use, because nothing is wasted in the eyes of God. Everything has a purpose. Every life has a value. Every unborn child, every person, irregardless of their abilities or intelligence, everyone who is sick, who is abused, or is hateful, every single life has value. And God, the divine bargain hunter, goes in search of all of them. God looks for everyone. God wants to embrace everyone. God wants to help everyone to recognize the beautiful way in which they were made. Now, we might be tempted to think that God reaches out to the lowly in some kind of condescending way, that he searches for them just to kind of make them feel good about themselves and gives them kind of a divine pat on the head like we would a little child. But that's not what St. Paul says. And that's not what Jesus reveals to us through the Beatitudes. Our readings today turn this upside down. Those who are lowly and weak and rejected will be exalted, and God will use them to shame the strong. Because God's not looking for the fancy fabric. God's not concerned about finding perfectly woven material. God doesn't limit himself to looking for people who have it all together and are absolutely flawless. God is looking for the lowly and the humble. He is drawn to those that are weak so that his glory can be revealed in them. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to go out and start sinning and make ourselves dejected and pushed out to the margins of society. There is something in us already that is separated from God, that is lowly, that is weak, that falls to temptation. And God's eye is drawn to that weakness so that he can pull us to himself. And God does this in different ways. We can think of St. Catherine of Siena, who with great boldness brought about this necessary renewal in the church. She once wrote to Pope Gregory XI, this is a fantastic line. She said, "Christ has given you authority, and because you have accepted it, you ought to use your virtue and power. If you do not wish to use it, it would be better for you to resign." Pretty strong words from a woman to the Holy Father. And not only does God use lowly people to correct the strong, but God also dives into our hearts to find the gifts that we think are just scraps, gifts that we think aren't really that useful. Gifts that are buried deep down in our hearts and in our minds that we may not use because we don't consider them of any benefit to our brothers and sisters. Those are the gifts that God wants. God wants to find every single talent that he has placed within us. He wants to find every single desire that we have buried and pushed down and repressed. God wants to find all of those things that he has placed in our hearts, to pull them to the surface and to use them for the sake of our brothers and sisters. And our task is to simply not resist, to not cover ourselves up, to not hold back when the Lord wants to pull it to the surface. I think far too often we consider ourselves to be useless in the hands of God. We think that we're not good enough to be his vessel, or that our sin prohibits us from playing a role in his kingdom. But we have to remember that Jesus delivered the Beatitudes to a group of people that were not rich and mighty and powerful, but to people who were sick, people who were blind and lame, people who were possessed by demons. Can you imagine the joy that must have welled up in their hearts when they heard Jesus say, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are they who mourn, blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness"? Can you imagine what was going through their hearts, thinking, this is not a message that's far off. This is not something that is beyond my reach. He's speaking to me. He's speaking to my heart. Can you imagine that God can use someone who could never walk? Can you imagine that God could use someone who could never see? Can you imagine that God can use someone who was possessed by a demon? Because he does. So no matter how badly we've sinned, no matter how weak we think we are, no matter how unworthy we believe ourselves to be, just know that God calls us. He calls all of us to use us so that his glory can be seen in our weakness, in our lowliness, and in our humility. We have to learn to trust more in God's promise than in our own self-image. We have to learn to depend on God's strength rather than our own. We have to learn that our dignity doesn't require our perfection, but it requires God's profound mercy. So friends, let's not be ashamed to be the remnant, the people that God leaves among his people, people who have turned away, to remind them of his presence. Let's be proud that he has chosen us to be the sign of his presence in a broken world.